Mental health here with Dr. Patino in his office and me in my home office. And we're going to discuss a little bit of an interesting topic. I think a very interesting topic because I'm kind of experiencing it myself. And it's men and loneliness, but not so much being, oh God, I'm alone, just the lack of actual deep and rewarding friendships. And I know, Doctor, you sent me a couple articles on this week. It's a big thing out there. Men are isolated. Why?
Oh my God, that's the $54,000 question. It is a complex issue, and is complex both culturally, psychologically, biologically, and it's complex because it has changed over time. Right? We have looked at men being alone from different perspectives over the history of manhood, right? Of the history of humanity, if you may. And if you start thinking in terms of the purpose of humanity at the early stages of development of human beings, men had a role, right? Their role was very well defined in terms of hunters, gatherers, trying to protect, and actually were built biologically to do those things, right? Okay, fast forward to 2023.
But you're
and when
skipping over the Neolithic Revolution. Wait a minute.
well, I'll get back to it, but if you make a big jump, you're gonna see that the need for that is kind of different, especially in advanced, well-educated societies, right? And I'm saying it that way because I was looking at some statistics the other day, looking at the world in general, and what percentage of people in the world are over the age of 65?
Hmm.
It's only about 8%
Yeah, it's
of the
actually
total
small.
world population. So there's a small percentage of the world population that are older, right? And most of the studies that have been done in terms of longevity have always paid attention to three factors. Well, actually, recently had paid attention to three factors: biology, psychology, and sociology. But if you look at history, longevity was not that big of a deal, right? Why? Because there was a huge difference between those who were traditionally poor and uneducated, and the ones who were educated and wealthy, right? So the disparities on humanity in terms of uh, money, in terms of education, had implications in terms of longevity.
Mhm.
Now, men were, for a very long time, even up until the 1950s, early 1960s, even in advanced, well educated societies, were always looked at as leaders. They were always looked at as the strong people who were the leads of maintaining in structure, right? And maintaining peace or war, whichever way they wanted to go with, because biologically they had the strength, they have the drive, and they had a responsibility to provide, right?
Mhm.
Now, that comes with baggage, because if you are educated and you've been educated like that most of your life, you always are being told that you are it, but you are it alone. You're not it with other people, and that you have to demonstrate that you can go out and do on your own,
The
by
self-made
yourself,
man.
right? And that's still somewhat of an issue. Now, what has happened though, psychologically and socially, is that there was a time when that was almost venerated, right? I mean, if you go back to the Romans and the gladiators, and we still have somewhat of that with sports, right? We tend to value that image quite a bit. But since the 1960s till now, not as much. To the extreme that today is actually perceived as a deficit. If you are strong and aggressive and you are trying to lead with your energy and your motivation and your strength, then you are not accepted. So everything we've learned
Familiar with
now,
that.
everything we've learned is not acceptable anymore. So what men has done is retracted,
Mm.
become isolated. I mean, I was showing you some statistics the other day, and approximately 15% of men don't have any friends.
Which is incredible. But I get
Exactly.
that. I do actually get that.
Tell me
Um,
about it. What do you get from it?
well, unfortunately, over these last 4 years, or at least the prior administration, so much more additional division. I used to be the guy that a lot of people came to for advice. Unfortunately, because my views were not the same as theirs, overnight became the idiot. Whatever, that kind of went away. And then when my friend Kevin died, um, I realized I had literally nobody to speak with, just none. He was my only true friend in the sense that never got together because he needed something from me. Because of my background, people want to train, they want advice, they want something. It was never an egalitarian relationship. So for my buddy Kevin, and it's weird because it wasn't until literally his death just a little bit over a year ago, when he did pass, it hit me like a ton of bricks. I'm like, oh my god, he's my only real friend, where it doesn't matter what's going on in the world, we can get together and there was equal sharing. And
And
it's been,
that
and
is
that's
a
just very that's very rare, I think.
that's a very important point, because when you look at the how do we go about establishing relationships, the word trust comes to mind, right? Men had been educated and raised to not trust, to be defensive, to doubt. So we carry that baggage, and it becomes difficult to let people see our feelings. We don't want anybody to see what we feel. So when you find somebody that you can communicate in a trusting, emotional way, and you can tell, I'm hurting, I feel lonely, I feel empty, I feel sad, I feel happy, right? Uh, we tend to value that. But what I found is that men tend to overvalue it, and it becomes a limit in terms of who else do you allow in.
Mm.
It's like there's not a need for a lot of friends. You have a small number of friends, and then you don't want to take the risk of exploring again.
Mm.
All right. And that has pretty serious biological, psychological, and social consequences, right? Um, there is a very interesting study that was done by Harvard University. Uh, I don't know, 90 years ago, was started with 268 individuals that were at Harvard. By the way, one of them was President Kennedy, right?
Mm.
Eventually, he died younger. And they followed them for 80 years. That study is still in process, right? By the time they kind of started publishing some of the data, and there were two different iterations of the study, was around 2015 to 2017, around that. There's actually a paper written about that. There were only 19 people left, and they were looking at different parameters. And what I find fascinating in this study is that when they started, they had this idea that genetics kind of predetermined everything, right? So the size of your head, your bones, your teeth, the history in your family, how long did the family live, and the longevity of other members of the family, and so on. And this went on for almost 90 years. And it's really fascinating to learn after 80 years with that number of people that the parameters that had the most impact among these individuals, and we have to realize that they were probably mostly Anglo-Saxon,
Yeah,
wealthy people,
upper middle
right?
class,
Upper middle
waspy
class.
guys. Yeah.
Yeah. So, but even in those circumstances, you have somewhat of a relationship in a kind of homogeneous type of population. And what they found is that longevity was not related to genetics as much. Okay. It was not related to temperament as much. It was highly related to a couple of things like the healthiness of your marriage and your relationships, right? So it's really fascinating to see that one of the conclusions of this study is that loneliness is really toxic and is particularly toxic to men, right? Because it leads you to have to be with you too much and having to deal with your own stress internally without creating trustful relationships, which is kind of uh, fascinating because, in my experience, the opposite of that is when you have too much loneliness. I also see a lot of consequence in your relationships.
Mhm.
Okay, let's say that you're a lonely person who don't trust other people emotionally. That may have a serious impact in your marriage, right? Because you have
It
to
certainly
trust.
could. Yeah, but I think that part of that's how you grew up. I grew up without any male influence or good male influence, but I had a sister who was very close to me. So as much as my wife is my wife, I kind of have that buddy relationship with her. I mean, some people would even look at it and go, "You guys don't act like you're married, or act like you're just friends." And well, that's what we're supposed to be, right? Friends first. So I think a lot of that depends on how people grow up. But I noticed though with men, as in some of the areas I wander about in, seem desperate to find an identity that's outside of them. Is that part of this? I mean, the guys who are, they wear all the uniforms for their football team. I mean, they get clinically depressed if their team loses, even though they weren't directly participating into it. The guys in my world, the gun guys or the martial arts guys, they're seeking a group of like-minded people in order to find some connection. Is that part of what we're seeing here?
Well, it's a reflection of the loneliness, right?
Mm.
That you become what you belong to. You become the acceptance from other people for some of your qualities, right? But the problem with that is that you never expose your deficits, right? You never allow somebody to. I mean, you don't see. And I have friends, very close friends, and I have acquaintances, right? And it's really interesting to see how I talk to my friends and how I talk to my acquaintances. And I can have great conversations with both, but one has a lot of emotional substance. The other one is a friendship, right? It's not a trusting emotional relationship. And I think that if I have to say it this way, I think that men have to have at least one trusting relationship. Now, the ideal trusting relationship um, does not exist because we always have to keep something to ourselves for our own protection, right? So it's all a matter of how much. And we kind of go back and forth, right? But I see men, because I mean, I've been doing this for 34 years. I've seen a lot of men that come to me primarily because they want somebody to listen in a non-judgmental way. One of the biggest fear that men have is to expose themselves emotionally and have to be confronted with indifference or even criticism or at the worst case rejection, right? Because you are taking a huge risk when you open your heart to other people. Now, that requires practice, right? And I always tell, if you have a relationship, a romantic relationship, whether it's heterosexual, homosexual, whatever it is, you have to take the risk of let them see you, right? Because you have to be in an environment where you can practice. Because what happens is that then we tend to become very restrictive. So let's use situation you're at work, right? And your boss is criticizing you and he's telling you how bad of an employee you are and all that, and you just take it. You just take it, and then you go home, and then either you get mad at yourself, you get depressed, you start yelling at your significant other or your children, right? But the reality is that at that moment, you had to take the risk of saying, I hear what you're saying, I don't necessarily agree with it.
Mm.
But saying it is a huge risk
Oh yeah,
because
absolutely.
you may get fired, or because you're starting to show some of your emotional self. And if you're feeling insecure by yourself, you're not going to do it.
Mm.
You're not going to do it because the fear of that rejection or criticism is such that you're not going to allow anybody to see your feelings. You're not going to allow anybody to make you vulnerable. So, men don't deal well with vulnerability. And the consequences can be pretty serious, though.
So what about the introverts? Like the natural. I mean, I'm a guy. Admittedly, I'm my job is not just this one, but the other ones I do. I'm out. I'm on stage the entire time. I'm interacting with tons of people. I've got my acting part on as I teach. I put a ton of energy into it. Then I come home. I need to be by myself, completely alone for hours to recharge from it. Um, what about those people?
Well,
Because I'm not lonely. I can honestly tell you that I've never actually felt lonely in my life, even though I'm alone a lot.
yeah, but you see, when you go back home after you have been on stage and you have taken the risk of exposing yourself to people and showing your experience and knowledge and all of that, right? Regardless of them liking it or not liking it, right? When you go back home, you don't go home to be alone. You go home to be with you.
Hmm.
And what happened to most men who feel lonely is that they don't like being with themselves, right? So an introvert in general, a well mature introvert, will be better able to manage vulnerability as a requirement of functioning, right? But they would not have a problem going home and saying, I feel lonely because I'm with me. And at the end of the day, if you don't know where your value comes from and you don't know what you have to give, it's like going home with somebody you don't like.
Hmm.
Think about it having, I mean, in the extreme cases, think about going home with the person you hate the most, right? And you had to spend all your lonely time with that person. That's gotta be painful, right? And I'm not saying that everybody should love themselves and appreciate yourself and be self centered and narcissistic. What I'm saying is that there's got to be a balance of recognition of our assets and our deficits and be honest with ourselves. If we're not honest with ourselves, how can we trust other people with ourselves if we don't even trust ourselves?
Well, I think that's it's. You just hit on something. I think that's one of the biggest challenges for men, especially in our kind of quasi-macho society, is that they don't want to accept their limitations. They don't want to look at the mirror because they have that image of the guy they want to be versus the person they really are. And the person they really are may be very different than the person they want to be or they're projecting out there. How does a person accept their shortcomings when they so desperately don't want to have any?
Well, you have to practice. That's when you expose yourself. Let's say you have a significant other, and that significant other is a good listener, right? Who's willing to hear your pain, who's willing to hear, I feel insecure. I feel that I'm not as good as other people think I am, right? Uh, and it starts listening to you in a non judgmental, non critical, non rejecting way. Then you start practicing and you learn that nothing happens, right? Uh, I mean, like telling your boss, I hear what you're saying, but it seems to me that you're being too aggressive,
Hmm.
right? That's how I feel what you're saying, right? Now, huge risk, right? You're not going to take that risk if you haven't practiced it before, but practice makes perfect. So you have to start small. You don't have to open up 100%, right? But it's the listening of the other person that makes the difference. And what happens is in relationships, not unusually, when the man takes the risk and the other person is not listening, and he feels a need to fix the problem of the man, you're lost already
Mm.
because you're not being understanding. You're trying to fix, and when you're trying to fix, the message you're delivering is, you are totally screwed up. I have to fix you, right? So, listening in a careful way, listening to learn, not to solve, becomes the answer, right?
So if somebody doesn't have an empathetic listener in their lives, whether it be a friend, a spouse, or the like, um, sounds like some of us could really benefit from having a therapy session,
You
right?
see,
A professional listener.
most of the men that I've seen in my career, both for psychiatric issues and psychological issues, have not come to me because they wanted to. They come to me because the risk of not doing it and the consequences of not doing it is more painful than doing it, right? And it takes time for them to feel comfortable talking to someone. So, again, and I tell therapists all the time, and my students and other doctors, listen to what the patient is trying to tell you, not just what the patient is telling you, right? Don't be quick to give direction.
Mm.
Most of the people that goes to see the therapist is not going to the therapist to hear what they need to do. They just wanting somebody to listen and then provide them with some options that they can exercise.
Mm.
It's not it's not rocket science, but is very emotionally draining both for the therapist and the patient to have a good session, right? Because you have to be in tune in what the patient needs, not what you have to say. Most of the time, the patient will find answers from the communication is having with you. And when they don't, then you provide them with some options. But it's not our job to fix people. Okay? We have to start from the premise that the people that come to see the therapist are normal people with a problem. They're not problem people.
Mm.
They come to you thinking they're a problem. And if they come to you and you say, "Oh yeah, you're totally screwed up," it's not gonna work, right? So we have to be sensitive enough as professionals to hear. Okay, hear more, talk less.
Okay, so for those people, again, guys out there listening to this who want to go down this road but are very hesitant, I've heard there are, in fact, I'm listening to an audible book on this ways for almost self therapy. They call it, I guess, free writing, where you sit down with a piece of paper and you just write. You put down whatever you're thinking, whatever you're feeling, and just leave it there. And you can either burn it or leave it or read it later. Is that a legitimate way to start? Because I think part of the issue is men really can't communicate their feelings. But if they're just writing it down, the only person they're communicating it to is really themselves. Is that
Well,
beneficial at all?
it is very useful to learn relaxation techniques and to learn to communicate with oneself. But you really have to get to the point of recognizing that there's two of you. There's the you that you show to the world
Mhm.
and the you that only you see. And there's got to be some balance between those two. And I have to tell you, I think that we have been fooling ourselves for so long that we are the leader and the strong, and we strive to be that all the time, that we forget to talk to the other half of ourselves. And then not only that, we start writing and start becoming dishonest with ourselves,
Mm.
right? We start writing to convince ourselves that we are that strong person, right? And that we don't have any emotions and nobody can hurt us. Well, we don't have to worry about other people hurting us when we're hurting ourselves, right? So we have to start by making a pact with ourselves of honesty. And we have to start realizing that what makes us valuable, and we've talked about this before, is not who we are, is not what we do, is not what we accomplish. We're valuable if we have good values. That's it. Okay. I mean, I had to tell people sometimes, you can't be sitting on top of the mountain by yourself and everybody else is around is gone, but you still have you and you have value.
Mm.
Even if nobody recognizes it, even if nobody tells you how wonderful you are, even if you're not hunting and bringing food to the house, your values make you strong and valuable. So, what are those values? Your ability to care, your ability to give, your ability to love, your ability to understand, your ability to be empathic with other people, your values in terms of faith. Those things are yours. You don't have to be hunting for those things. You either have them or you don't. And I have to tell you, in my experience, most people do, but
Mm.
they don't want to look at them because they think that your values make you weak, right? I mean, and sometimes you have to block those values depending on what you're doing. I mean, if you're a defensive tackle in a professional football game, you're not going to be worrying if you're going to hit the guy too hard or not, right?
Hmm.
At that moment. But and I go back to the event that happened with the Buffalo Bills a couple of weeks ago, which is you can see what happens when somebody gets seriously hurt. You had a bunch of men, okay, that the world perceives as strong, driven, aggressive, right? Showing their emotions, their values. That's valuable, right? So people have to understand I am a good person because I have good values, and it stops there. It's not, and because of that, I'm the most wonderful football player, or whatever.
Mm.
Because nobody is going to be with you as much as you're going to be with yourself. So if you're going to spend a lot of time alone, you better spend it with somebody you're comfortable with. Because what kills people from loneliness is that we're spending a lot of time with somebody we don't like. And we're fooling ourselves pretending that we do like ourselves.
So the first step is really just spend some time to getting to know yourself. Be a little non-judgmental there too. If you're going through that list of things that aren't what you want it to be okay with that. I know years ago I got very open about I'm a weepy guy sometimes, man. I'll look at a sunset and start crying, and I'm good with that. It took me a while. It was really embarrassing for the longest time. Then I'm like, I'm good, and I'll do it openly in front of people. um, Very fortunate too that when I've been the guy a lot of people come to, including some of the toughest dudes on the planet. I've had pro athletes, commandos, break down and cry in front of me. For some reason, they feel comfortable doing that in front of me, which oddly enough fed my value system. I said, "Wow, I must be doing something right that these guys are comfortable doing that in front of me." And I know
You,
it's kind of a neat thing.
you, you're listening empathically, and
Yeah,
that takes time to develop. But I always tell people, let's start with giving ourselves a big hug,
yeah.
and let's practice that. I mean, you actually had to practice it, right? That you're okay to be with. How can we expect anybody's going to be with us if we don't want to be with ourselves, right? So let's balance that. Let's say I this is what I have to give and this is what I have to take. All
And
right?
once you accept that, it's really difficult to actually ever be lonely. Then
Because you're always with you.
exactly, only
Nobody's
you.
gonna nobody's gonna spend more time with you than you.
Absolutely. Well, doctor, once again, truly appreciate it. I think you're going on a trip here, so bon voyage, as they say, and
Yeah.
we'll see you back soon.
Take care, man. Have a good
Take
night.
care. Bye bye.